Well, that's a tough act to follow. Okay. I just want to introduce myself, and I'm going to be speaking extemporaneously. So if you don't understand a word or a place or a person I'm speaking about, please raise your hand and let me know. About 5, 7, 10 years ago, I went to a dinner to raise funds for the Maccabeah Games, and that's the Jewish Olympics. And the head speaker that was invited got up, and this is apropos to history because names, places, and events tend to repeat themselves in the papers and in books and in movies. Donald Trump Jr. got up to speak, and the first thing he said was, "I know you're all wondering what I'm doing here." So that's how I'm going to start my presentation. I'm Jewish, but I connected to an amazing unit, World War II unit, all black tankers division, 761st Tank Battalion, and it was a gift that keeps on giving for me. So I'm very happy to be here and tell you about my connection to the 761st. Okay. Yes?
Got to go back one.
Right.
Let's see. Piece of paper. There we go. They're almost there. I'll make the microphone.
Before dawn, November 8, 1944, northeast France, 50 miles from the German border. Thunderous explosions from more than 500 heavy artillery guns shake the ground as George Patton's Third Army resumes its advance toward Germany. Cramped inside tanks near the front lines, the smell of gasoline and sweat filling their turrets, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion were about to make a secret. They would become the first African-American tankers to see combat in the U.S. Army. Before dawn, they received the order to advance. Reaching the front, they were met with fierce explosions of enemy shells as the Germans counterattacked. Infantrymen fell on all sides, and the air filled with smoke and death. Able Company's lead tank hit a roadblock, and Sergeant Reuben Rivers, under heavy fire, climbed from the tank to clear the obstruction, allowing his company to press forward in its attack. For his bravery, Sergeant Rivers was awarded the Silver Star and thus became the first great hero of the 761st. The motto of the 761st Tank Battalion was, "Come out fighting." Their story began long before they landed in France at Omaha Beach the month prior. In March 1941, 98 black enlisted men reported to Fort Knox to train in tank operations and mechanized warfare. Over the next year, more men joined. And in March 1942, the 761st was born. The 761st earned their nickname, the Black Panthers, while in France, standing toe-to-toe with Hitler's vaunted Panther tanks. Time and again, the 761st showed fierce determination and proved themselves to be men of valor. On November 10th, Sergeant Warren Creasy took command of another vehicle after his tank was disabled, and armed with only a machine gun, took out the enemy position. First Sergeant Samuel Turley, commanding a team under heavy attack, enabled his men to retreat to safety while he single-handedly held back the German onslaught, giving his life to save his men. When Reuben Rivers' tank hit a landmine November 16th, the resulting explosion severely wounded his leg. Refusing morphine or evacuation, he took control of a second tank, disabling 4 German tanks and forcing them to withdraw. 3 days later, during an assault on a nearby village, Rivers concentrated fire on the German position, allowing pinned-down Americans to escape. Rivers refused to yield until his turret suffered 2 direct hits, silencing his gun and ending his life. The next month, the 761st was engaged in the epic Battle of the Bulge, fighting to relieve the 101st Airborne Division, which was surrounded at Bastogne, Belgium. The 761st split the German lines in 3 places, helping relieve beleaguered Allied paratroopers. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion fought for 6 months straight on the front lines without relief. Despite suffering a heavy casualty rate of nearly 50%, they inflicted 130,000 casualties on the German army and liberated more than 30 towns, yet full recognition of the 761st's heroic service took time. In 1978, it was awarded the Presidential Human Citation. Then, in 1997, 53 years after his legendary exploits on the battlefield in France, Sergeant Reuben Rivers was finally honored with our nation's highest military award, the Medal of Honor. The 761st made history in becoming the first African-American tankers to see combat. Through their selfless service on the front lines, while proving to their countrymen that they were true and worthy soldiers, the 761st proved to be men of valor on and off the battlefield.
In the mid-90s, I was the head of a Holocaust commemoration program. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and for about 10, 12 years, I was the head of a Holocaust commemoration program at Kane University. And there was a candlelighting ceremony every year where we would invite 6 Holocaust survivors to come up and light a candle. In 1999, I read an article in the Star-Ledger about someone named Johnny Stevens. And when I came to the program, I was determined to change it a bit, to recognize other people that fought in the war. My parents every year celebrated April 15th, 1945. They were liberated from the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, so every year we celebrated their real birthday, which they didn't even know what it was, and April 15th. I read about Johnny Stevens, and I invited him to our program. It was too late to have him light a candle. It was 1999. And my parents and other survivors always believed that any of the Allied soldiers were liberators. We considered them liberators. They liberated Europe. They liberated the Pacific. This is a picture of Johnny Stevens. Okay, that's the program. In 1999, I had him hold the American flag during the national anthem. And after the program, well, I greeted him, and after the program, he came over to me, and I thanked him, and I told him that next year we'll have him light a candle. Next year came around, and he saw me, and he grabbed my hand. And he grabbed my hand, and he was a sergeant in the 761st, and he looked into my eyes the same way other Holocaust survivors had looked into my eyes, and he wouldn't let go of my hand. And he started telling me about how his unit liberated a concentration camp. And it had been with him his entire life. It's one thing he remembered about liberating the camp and about his service in the war. Oops. Okay. You can see Johnny Stevens there. He lit a candle, and he wouldn't let go of my hand, and he made sure that I heard what he had to say. I think he reverted back to being a sergeant. That was in the year 2000. We spoke periodically after that, and in 2004, I believe, I saw another article about Johnny Stevens in the paper. His home was being taken away from him through eminent domain in Carteret. Correct? 2004? I'm going to introduce you to his daughter soon. So I read the article, and I wanted to help him, but it was the economy was very bad, and I actually had been laid off from a job where I was working for a builder, and the property we were building was old naval yards in Perth Amboy, taken through eminent domain. And I spoke to Johnny, and I said, can I help you with a lawyer? Can I help you? And he said, I have a lawyer. And next thing I know, he turns up on Hannity and Combs. And I will never forget what he said. He said, I served my country. All I want to do is be left alone and sit in my garden and not be bothered. So, of course, they knocked down the homes all around his home. And I'll get to that in a second. I have the video. It's very fascinating. 2007, I opened the Star Ledger again, and Johnny passed away. And I'm getting chills now as I remember it. I don't know why, but it affected me. His death affected me greatly. And I had been, just as many survivors' deaths, because they had experienced something, and if you didn't make a movie about it, you didn't talk about it, especially the 761st, it was a racist army, so no one knew about the exploits of the 761st. And it really hit me like a ton of bricks. So I started to research the unit. And I call myself a hobby historian. And I just kept uncovering unbelievable material about the 761st and about Johnny Stevens. I started to write about it. I started to write about the unit, and I did a chronology of the unit, and I felt that this story of the 761st needed to be told and needed to be taught in schools. As you can see, I put a lot of effort into it. That's some of it. Now, I became obsessed with the 761st. So let me tell you a little bit about the unit. It was a racist army. Most people don't realize that when the war broke out, many blacks volunteered, were not necessarily called up to fight, but they volunteered. Over 500,000 blacks served in World War II. And they were patriotic. I'll get back to this in a second. Well, actually, I'll tell you about it now. 761st first started training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And it was a racist army, and the soldiers that were sent to Fort Knox were told to sit in the front of the railroad cars that were taking them to Fort Knox. And they were used to sitting in the back. So they were on their way to Fort Knox, and the commanding officer told them to pull the shades down. Why? Because when they were traveling through Kentucky, people were shooting into the windows. And the smoke from the coal affected the first car. So that's why they were told to sit in the front of the trains. From there, they went to Camp Claiborne, and at Camp Claiborne, Jackie Robinson joined the unit. Jackie Robinson was a 4-sport star at UCLA. Most people don't know that baseball was his fourth best sport. And he joined as an officer, and he was told to go into the officers training program by Joe Louis, a boxer. I'll get to that in a sec. All right. Okay, at home, does everybody recognize this? If I put two V's, the double V, it's not Richard Nixon. This was in the Pittsburgh Gazette, I believe, and it was the black newspaper that put up double V's, one victory abroad and victory at home. Joe Louis joined the Army, and they asked him before the Max Schmeling fight what he was going to do. And he said, I'm going to come out fighting. 761st took that as their slogan, and it was put on their uniforms. That's the patch, and it's the Black Panther. 761st were the first Black Panthers, as you can see. Now, Lena Horne went to entertain the troops, and when she came to Arkansas and she looked out into the audience, the front row were the white GIs, in the middle rows were the German POWs, and in the back rows were the black soldiers, at which point she packed up and left. So Jackie Robinson joins the unit. He was track, football, basketball, and like I said, his fourth best sport was baseball. But he broke his ankle. He broke his ankle playing football. He entered the 761st at Fort Hood, was later changed to Camp Hood, and he became the morale officer, a lieutenant in the 761st. Football star. Fort Hood was next to Killeen, Texas, outside of Killeen, Texas, which, if you ask anyone that was a black person that was in Fort Hood at that time, they would tell you that Selma or Birmingham or any of those places, Killeen was the worst, was the most racist city in the United States. He got on a bus to go into town, and he sat down next to a black officer's wife, but she was light-skinned, and the bus driver came over and told him, in words that you can imagine, to get in the back of the bus. Jackie Robinson got up and threatened to end his life if he talked to him like that again. The next stop, the MPs were waiting for him, took him off the bus, and the commanding officer, the white commanding officer of the 761st, Colonel Bates, was told to court-martial him. Colonel Bates, who had taken the commanding officer's position because he did not want a racist commanding officer to head the 761st, refused to court-martial Jackie Robinson, at which point Jackie was transferred out of the unit. And people don't know about this story, but it's a story about racism that should be taught in the schools. That's him joining the 761st. That's him at Camp Claiborne. Refuses to move to the back of the bus. That's Colonel Bates. And I'm a stamp enthusiast, and that's a cover letter. Now, so while he is getting court-martialed, and he was acquitted because they used the words of the bus driver who they said, what happened? And he said, I told this so-and-so to get off the bus, and he used the language that he used. He was acquitted, but he had had enough. He had had enough, so he was honorably discharged under the premise that his ankle had to keep him out of the war, at which point the 761st were on their way to England. Okay, so they trained in Fort Hood for years, and they trained every unit, every tank unit that went to fight in World War II. But in 1944, Patton said, I need tanks. The 88, the Panzer tanks were destroying the American tanks. So the 761st started to train in the Sherman tank. And they became experts. So they were called up, and Patton said, I don't care what color you are, I have only the best in my unit. I have only the best. And 4 months after D-Day, they landed in Normandy. They fought in France, at which point the 761st were the first tankers to enter Germany. First Americans to enter Germany, at which point Battle of the Bulge broke out, and they traveled 400 miles to Bastogne. And they fought, and they took over the town of Tillet. And Tillet was a very important town because they cut off the supply lines to the tankers that had been overwhelming the American army. And they helped save the 101st. They helped save the 101st. And I found this the other day. Through my historical ventures, I was given this book about the 101st by someone that lived here, Mickey Cohn. I don't know if any of you knew him, but fascinating person. So, 761st, no one knows about, no one believes could fight in armor, including Patton, who was a racist and an anti-Semite, but they've already pierced the Siegfried Line and entered Germany, and now they cut off the supply lines to the Panzers at Tillet, and they helped save the 101st. They continued to fight. They fought for 6 months straight. Those that were wounded had to go to a hospital, a segregated hospital. Those that could not go to a segregated hospital, entered a integrated hospital, at which point they were not sent home. They were forced to go back to fight. Most of them wanted to go back to fight because they did not want to be in the hospital. Okay. They fought in 6 countries: Luxembourg, Holland, Germany, France, Austria, and Belgium. Now, there was a writer that attached himself to the unit. His name was Tres Van Anderson, and he wrote a book called Come Out Fighting. There were 2,000 copies dispersed among the 760 members of the unit, and he recorded everything that happened. The infantry followed them, and they came across many concentration camps. And it was called a bastard unit because their tankers attached themselves to the various units as they were fighting, especially through Germany, and they helped liberate quite a few concentration camps. Most people don't know. They know Auschwitz and places like that, but there were over 2,000 camps. There were over 2,000. So they would knock the gates down and continue, and they attached themselves to the 71st Infantry, and they helped liberate a camp called Gunskirchenlager, which was a subcamp of Mauthausen in Austria. That was towards the end of the war. Of course, got no credit for helping liberate. And I met a man who his hobby is filming Holocaust survivors. His father was at Gunskirchenlager, but everyone, they're over 90, and they can't make it. We should have a program one Sunday afternoon. So I would invite this person and a member of the 101st was also supposed to come tonight. Unfortunately, he could not make it. His son-in-law told me that he's asleep by 7. So, and there is a member of the 71st Infantry up in Rockland County that also couldn't come because it's past his bedtime. So I continued to research the 761st, and what I came up with was unbelievable material. And I continued to research Johnny Stevens' story. Johnny, we children of Holocaust survivors and Holocaust survivors always were appreciated the stories of the liberators because they had no axe to grind. They were not Jewish, and many of them suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, just as the survivors did. Johnny, this is, history comes back all the time. Johnny, and I don't even know if Doreen, because I had a talk with Doreen a couple weeks ago, and you were young, so you don't know everything that your father did, but he was a real hero. He, in the 90s, there was a neo-Nazi group that was going to different campuses, taking out ads saying, did the Holocaust happen? They wanted to have a discussion on campus. And Johnny went with Deborah Lipstadt. If you know that name, Deborah Lipstadt was sued by a Holocaust denier named David Irving, and she went to trial and was acquitted because David Irving said that she defamed him by calling him a Holocaust denier. Johnny Stevens went out to University of Texas with Deborah Lipstadt and confronted the neo-Nazis, saying that they were Holocaust revisionists, and saying he was there, he saw it. Now, Johnny also was given many accolades from the Jewish community, and here he was honored by the Anti-Defamation League. Now, I researched Johnny's story in the 761st, but I had to go to work. And I had kids. There's my 2 little kids. So I put it aside. I had met with producers, Broadway producers, and I had met with filmmakers, and I had met with historians and book writers. I just didn't get anywhere. So I was at my computer about 8 years ago, something like that, and I would Google things in my spare time, sometimes not even in my spare time, and I Googled 761st Tank Battalion. This is 2 years after I let the story go, and up comes something saying that this was a Tuesday or Wednesday. Up came 761st Reunion, Chicago, Illinois. I was staring at the screen. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So I come home and I tell my wife, and she says, go fly out to Chicago. So this was a Wednesday or a Thursday, and the next day flight to Chicago was $1,500. Then my wife says to me, let's drive, let's go. And my wife is Israeli and doesn't drive on highways, and had no idea that Chicago was 15 hours away. She probably thought it was an hour away. I used to go, when I was in Israel, my relatives used to say to me, do you ever see my cousin in Texas? No, I haven't bumped into her. So I called up, made my reservation. We got in the car on Thursday afternoon at 5 after work, and I got in the car with my wife and my probably 3 or 4-year-old daughter and my 5 or 6-year-old son, and I started to drive to Chicago. On the way, I called the person running the reunion. It happens to be the black commanding officer's son, Ivan Harrison. Ivan Harrison Jr. So Ivan Harrison was the black commanding officer when, after Colonel Bates actually was wounded. In the first battle, Colonel Bates was wounded. Didn't come back till Austria. So I said, listen, you're not going to believe this story, but you know, I delved into the unit, and we discussed it, and I get to Chicago on Friday morning, and we're not in the room maybe 5 minutes when my son ordered a porno. I don't know how he did it. He thought he was ordering a Mickey Mouse movie, but that, and then we went downstairs and my daughter broke a lamp. It cost me $75. But Friday night, they had something scheduled, and my family stayed in our room, or we went down to swim or something like that. The next morning they had a service. They had a religious service. They had a white Catholic priest from down the block that had no idea what and who the 761st were, and he said a prayer, at which point I got up And I said, that's the front cover of the program. I said, do you mind if I say the prayer for the dead in Hebrew? He said, no problem. And everyone was looking at me anyway, because I was the only white person there. And I put on my yarmulke and I said the prayer for the dead. And people were coming over to me asking me, who are you? What are you doing here? And I kind of told them the story. Saturday night, I went down to the banquet, and I am the guest speaker. I had told Ivan Harrison that I had been involved with Holocaust education and had worked with the Kane University Holocaust Resource Center. And I come down, and I am the guest speaker. And I didn't know what to say necessarily, but I will briefly tell you what I said. My father was born in a famous city in Poland that's very famous in Jewish folklore. And there was a writer, some may know the name, Shalom Aleichem, was a Yiddish writer, and he made his living in Poland and Ukraine and Russia, going around and reading what he had written. He came to Kessel, Poland, and the people were talking while he was trying to read. And I'm telling this to the people. I said, after you hear this story, make sure you don't talk while I'm talking. And he went home and he started to write stories about the people from Kessel. What were they? He wrote about the wise men of Kessel. These people thought that they were the wisest people in the world. God had summoned two angels and he put intelligent souls in one sack and the not so intelligent souls in another sack. And he said, disperse them around the countryside. The angel with the not so wise soul hit a mountain and dropped all of his souls, the not so wise souls, on Kessel. And Shalom Aleichem wrote these stories. For instance, they were so smart that they needed trees on the mountain. They needed to cut down trees on the mountain to build new homes for people because Kessel was expanding. So they went up the mountain, they cut these trees down, they carried them down, and then the rabbi, who was the wisest man of Kessel, says, why are you cutting these trees down and carrying them down? Why don't you roll them down the mountain? So what did they do? They carried them back up the mountain and then rolled them down. So I told 3 or 4 of those stories. And then I said, Kessel was a real place. Kessel was a way station to the 3 Holocaust, the 3 concentration camps, death camps, Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. And there were sometimes trains backed up to go to the death camps through Kessel. And I said, Kessel is my legacy. The Holocaust is not my legacy. Kessel is my legacy, because there was a thriving Jewish community in Kessel before the Holocaust. That's my legacy. And we're the Kessel city, it's in my heart. And I said, the 761st is in your heart. That's your legacy. They fought in 6 countries, 6 months without a break, in the tanks. You know, the first battle, 5 minutes after they entered the first battle, a bomb exploded near a tank. And they went to see if anyone was injured. All 5 tankers were dead. And they had not moved from their seats, and all they had was blood coming out of their ears. The concussion had killed them. 5 minutes after the first battle started. I said, that's your legacy. That is the legacy of the 761st. So tell your children and go and speak and make it known. Make it known. That was the front cover. As you can see, that is Colonel Bates' son and his wife, and I'm there, and that's Ivan Harrison Jr. And when it was over, this is probably the greatest gift I've ever received. That was a copy of the unit citation. And anyone that has anyone in the military knows that to get a unit citation was virtually impossible. Okay, I'm going to speed up. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote a book about the unit. This is the book he wrote, Brothers in Arms, about the unit. His father was best friends with a member of the unit. That's how he wrote the book. He sold the rights to the book to Forrest Whitaker and Denzel Washington. They never made the movie. I was friendly with a person from this area. His name was Joel Silver, and he was the biggest producer in Hollywood at the time. And he was going to make a movie, Sergeant Rock. Does anybody recognize this? This is a comic book, Sergeant Rock comic book. You keep raising your hand, you're so young. How do you know? He was going to make a movie, an unbelievable sergeant killing Nazis through all of Europe, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to be Sergeant Rock. So about a year ago, Joel Silver's fallen on hard times, and he did all the Die Hard movies and the Matrix movies. He was the biggest producer in Hollywood at the time, in the 80s. I wrote him a year or two ago, and I sent him an email. I said, I know you're Sergeant Rock. I have your Sergeant Rock. Johnny Stevens is your Sergeant Rock. I never heard from him. Okay, so after the reunion, I'm told that there is one survivor in Queens. His name is William McBurney. I call William McBurney, I go out to see him, I befriend him, we talk, and I say to him, do you want to go to the next reunion? It's in Tampa. Why is it in Tampa? Because Sir Colonel Bates' wife is still alive in Tampa. So they're going to take the reunion to her. I asked William McBurney, do you want to go? He said, yes. It's going to be the last reunion I go to. I didn't have the money to send him and his wife. I wanted to go, but I thought it was more important for him to go. I called the Jackie Robinson Foundation and told them the story, the 761st. I come to work one day, and there's a package for me. I open it up. It's a book from Mrs. Rachel Robinson, Jackie Robinson's wife, and I open up the front cover. It's Jackie Robinson's biography, and it says, Dear Mr. McBurney, Jackie remembers fondly of his time with the 761st, and we wish you good health, and we hope you have a good time at the reunion, or something like that. I didn't feel qualified to give this book to William McBurney. I didn't feel qualified. And you wouldn't believe the people that I called, and you wouldn't believe the people that I called about the 761st. Athletes, and movie makers, and historians. Nobody would help me. So I'm sitting watching Burns' movie about baseball, And these four guys, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Frank Robinson, Ernie Banks, are on the screen talking. And someone's voice comes up on this, in the background. He says, I grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida, and I saw Jackie Robinson get up at bat at spring training in Daytona Beach, and I was the first one. I climbed the center field fence. I climbed the tree, and I saw him get up, and he was my idol, and that's how I made it to the major leagues. Ed Charles, 1969 Mets. I've been a Met fan since 1969 because of my brother. And I couldn't believe what he had said. And he had written, he was the poet laureate of the New York Mets, the 69 Mets, and his most famous poem was Superstar, about Jackie Robinson. So I called the Mets, and of course I got what was told to me 50 times, write us an email. I can't write you a whole history book about the 761st. So the woman calls me the next day and says, give me your number. And about an hour later, Ed Charles calls me. And I tell him. But he'd love to come and meet William McBurney, and he'd love to present the book to him, but he needs a ride. So I MapQuest and I go out to Queens and I pick him up. And I present the book. He presents the book. And I kind of filmed it. It was an unbelievable discussion. They talked about the 761st. Ed Charles had served in the Army also. They talked about Jackie Robinson. They talked about Martin Luther King. They talked about Malcolm X. They talked about racism. They talked about the world as they knew it. It was an unbelievable experience. And I took my AT guy with me. IT. I don't go anywhere without him. He helps me out. Look how little he was back then. And it was an unbelievable experience, I have to tell you. Well, a couple of years ago, my son goes off with a friend of his, and he comes back, and I said, what'd you do? So we went to the movies. So what'd you see? So we saw 42, the Jackie Robinson movie. Ed Charles is in the movie. I said, what? What are you talking about? Ed Charles is in the Jackie Robinson movie? And if you remember correctly, Ed Charles is the little boy in the movie. Of course, he's sitting in the stands. Ed Charles climbed the tree. Well, okay, so some of the people that I connected with and called to send William McBurney to this reunion was Russell Simmons. And the next day, I get a call from Russell Simmons' secretary, says, we just spoke to William McBurney, he cannot go. He's not well, and he can't go. Okay, then, subsequently, I would go to see Mr. McBurney occasionally, and in 2015, June 16th, I write to the Jackie Robinson Foundation, and I'm told that William McBurney passed away. And this is what she wrote to me. I was saddened to learn of William McBurney's passing, and sincerest condolences, and commanded a platoon in the 761st, and thought very highly of the soldiers with whom he served in Texas. That was his funeral. He was the last member of the 761st alive. He passed away, he was about 94 years old, and I spoke at the funeral. And I told him, and this was the truth, I said, if you asked my son when he was little who his heroes were, he would have said Johnny Stevens, William McBurney, Ed Charles, and LeBron James. And that was the truth. And my daughter also on Halloween dresses up with a Mets uniform signed by Ed Charles. And I repeated, I didn't tell any stories about Helen, by the way. If I would have told you the one about, the rabbi used to get up early in the morning and knock on everyone's door to wake up for a prayer, but it had snowed the night before. And he said to himself, I can't walk around and wake everyone up. The snow is too beautiful. I'll mess the snow up. So what did they do? Everyone brought their door to him to knock on. Okay. No more? Okay, all right. Anyway, I spoke at the funeral. It was very emotional for me. One of the things I love about history, and I could never eloquently tell you why I love history, but I was telling someone the other day that if I was to read about George Washington, I feel like I'm the only one in the world that knows about George Washington. That's what history does for me. And I've been lucky enough to occupy my time with these fantastic projects and people. Well, one of the people that died in the 761st, his name was Thomas Bragg. For years, I've been trying to find out something about Thomas Bragg because I grew up in Elizabeth. And Thomas Bragg lived in Elizabeth when he was killed in action January 4th, 1945. And people would tell me that during the Vietnam War, they set fire to a building in St. Louis and destroyed all the records. And I don't know where you're going to find anything about Thomas Bragg. Well, about a week or two ago, I went to a lecture on genealogy, and I met my friend Anthony here, who is a scientist and a hobby genealogist. And I wrote him, and I said, listen, don't spend more than 5 minutes on this. And about an hour later, I get 15 pieces of paper telling me about Thomas Bragg, and where he grew up in Elizabeth, and his people. Now, let me go back a little bit. This is Reuben Rivers, who finally got the Medal of Honor. And there were others that deserved the Medal of Honor. Oh, go back. Now, like I said, that Doreen Stevens is here, Johnny Stevens' daughter. And as you can see, we have a picture of Johnny Stevens.
Somewhere.
No, right here.
Oh.
Why do we go on the
By the way, last week, and I don't expect any of you to know this, my son certainly knows it, the latest Call of Duty internet game came out. And it's supposed to be very close to the experience of the World War II soldier. Johnny Stevens was sent to California, and he was the expert on the first Call of Duty game. You can't make this stuff up, and it says it right there. He was on the first Call of Duty expert. Here, March of the Living is survivors and their families walk from Auschwitz to Birkenau. They call it the March of the Living. Here he was with a survivor, and I think he was supposed to go. I don't know if he went, but now Johnny Stevens, a few months before he passed away, 2 months, correct? 2 months before he passed away, he got the highest Medal of Honor from France. As you can see, I mean,
I remember that was in the paper.
the French Legion Medal of Honor from the French government. It was April 10th. He passed away in July of 2007. And there's Doreen. Where is she? That's you, right?
Yeah.
That's you. Okay. And when he passed away, oh no, when he was awarded the medal, Tom Hanks was filming Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan. Dear Mr. Stevens, congratulations on being awarded France's highest military honor for your service in the famed Black Panthers Tanker Battalion. You have not only helped to liberate half the world long ago, you leave an inspiration for centuries to come. God bless you, Tom Hanks. And so, Johnny Stevens goes back to Carteret. He has all these medals, and he goes to the bus station, told to get back in the bus again. Comes to Carteret. No one in the Carteret school system ever asked Johnny Stevens to speak. He never spoke at any school in Carteret. Well, but they named a Head Start building, a daycare center after Johnny Stevens. And what do you think happened to that building?
Burned down.
Eminent domain. Tore the building down. This picture was hanging in the building. And last week I called the mayor of Carteret and I invited him here. This picture needs to go into City Hall. This picture needs to go into City Hall. I mean, there's so much more to this story. When I began, I wanted to tell you what my goal was, in case I would speak too long. This is a story, this is a sports story, this is a human rights story, this is a World War II story, this is a civil rights story, this is a Holocaust story. Children all over the United States need to hear this story. They need to learn this story. They need to study this story. History is, if you get the right project, you get the right, read the right book, it's a gift that keeps on giving. There is so much more to Johnny's story in the 761st. If you're a teacher, if you're a superintendent, I also wrote a treatment for a play, and I cannot make a movie about the 761st because Denzel Washington and Forrest Whitaker have the rights, but I think that a book about Johnny Stevens or a short documentary about Johnny Stevens would be a magnificent project.
Right.
And Kane University has opened a human rights center, and I was at the president's office a week ago. Doreen has pictures. There's a picture of Johnny Stevens with Paul Robeson, who came to entertain the troops, and these are black soldiers in a segregated army that all stood up and sang the Star-Spangled Banner with Paul Robeson. Nobody took a knee. Nobody took a knee. So that's my talk.
I have to tell you something.
Yes.
I received a poem from a man in England who was doing a project for the British Embassy and Romania to teach the Holocaust. It was a poem that was translated in English. And he asked a woman by the name of Barbara Wynn, who heads up the Holocaust at Metro West in Whippany, New Jersey, if she knew of a teacher who would write a lesson plan for this poem. And it was about the black angel who a survivor, well, she was liberated by this black angel, and she titled it The Black Angel. I'll be glad to give you a copy of the poem. I wrote the lesson plan for him to use in Romania, and it is posted in the Holocaust Commission. It's posted in New Jersey in the Holocaust Education Department.
Love to see it.
And it has been, some churches, black churches have used it, as well as Barbara has used it as well. But it's written by, I believe, a Romanian Holocaust survivor who was the 761st was the battalion that
Love to see it.
did, and I'll be glad to give it to you.
I just want to read something that Johnny Stevens, commanding officer, wrote about him. Let's see. I had... He kind of likes you.
That's.
I had some tough guys, Johnny Stevens, who would cut your throat in a minute. A tough, nasty staff sergeant. He was a maverick. I said, Johnny, I should have court-martialed you, but you were too good a fighter. We have pictures. I have a lot of material. Doreen, I want to introduce you to Doreen. Please, you want to come up? Cheryl, do you want to come up also?
Sure, why not?
Relative? This is Doreen, and I wrote a lot about Johnny Stevens, and I went to see Doreen and Johnny's wife, Evelyn, right? Right after he passed away, and my last line, well, there are two important lines that I remember. One, apropos to today, Johnny Stevens said, I don't kneel for anyone except God. That was one of his most important quotes. But and the last line of what I wrote about Johnny is that the back door was open, and I could see out the back door a pile of dirt higher than 2 floors of an apartment building. And they built, Kaplan Brothers built these condominiums surrounding Johnny's home. And she's still there, and the home is still there, surrounded by new condominiums. So I named it 4 battles. He fought racism, he fought eminent domain, he fought cancer, and he fought the other one. But he finally he lost the war to cancer. But anyway, this is Doreen. She's a bit shy.
Well, I'm not really the talker in the family. The man over here, he would have talked everybody's ears off. But I just thank Pete for continuing this battle that he's in, because it's important. I've had arguments with people telling me that there was no Holocaust.
Right.
I said, no, my father was there, so I know there was a Holocaust. You cannot, that doesn't fly with me. And I'm his daughter, that blood runs through my veins, so I'm as tough as he was, but not quite maybe as humble. My father's a very humble man, very kind, very gracious, and the state that the world is in today is so ugly, and my father had like no part. He never treated anybody anyway, but fairly, and I guess that's because of the ways that he had been treated. But Pete, he just like blended in. My father loved this man right here too. And as you can tell, as he speaks about him, I see the love that he had for my father. My father was a very good man. He was very kind and always a fighter. So in my family, that's what we learned, to live right, to do right, to treat people right, and to just be the best you can be. And anything I can do to help him, I'm here for you, and we appreciate you keeping the memory and everything alive. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I certainly have enjoyed. It has really been uplifting to see and learn a lot of things that I did not know. Just a few things about Uncle Johnny. One of the things that I remember vividly, he was just a big, tall guy. And he always seemed like the savior of the family. But I wanted to say that I know that he, had a lot of struggles, but he overcame them. And he was the first black bus driver to drive the bus in Middlesex County for public service. I don't know if everybody remember public service bus company, but we used to travel and go to Canada and all different places with him, which was a joy. And one other thing that I know, that he put his sisters through college. And one of his sisters became the first black principal in the Carteret school system. And her grandson became the first superintendent in Carteret. So I just look at that and
Like I said, that it's a gift that keeps on giving. I was looking for something today, and I found this. I had bought this on eBay, Collier's, and two reasons I bought it. It was, by the way, it's dated March 2nd, 1946. One, there's an ad about a Jewish artist. His name was Arthur Schick, that I really I follow. It's very beautiful stuff. And there was an article about Jackie Robinson in it. And so this is 46. This is before he played in the game. And at the it talks about his sports prowess. And at the end it says, it's just one line, it says, and he was honorably discharged because of his broken ankle. Not one word about a trial, a court-martial, not one word. Can you imagine? And this was a couple months before. Yeah. Yes, Sam?
61st.
Excuse me?
The best way I understand what these boys were like, and they were boys, they were 18. On the Discovery Channel, they were interviewing a Nazi who was a POW. He was on the cliffs of Normandy in a pillbox. He was a machine gunner. He knew the Americans were coming. They knew the Americans were invading. And they thought nothing of it. They were the most professional, toughest, seasoned fighting force on the planet. They invaded Poland. And the Poles didn't even fight hard for Poland. The Blitzkrieg, it was over in a couple of days. They invaded France, and the French surrendered. They didn't even defend France. And they were up there, and they thought, what is a kid from Newark, New Jersey, a kid from Minnesota, from Texas, from Carteret, what are they going to give a damn about fighting for Europe? And he said, we saw the Americans coming, and we started killing them. And he said, and we were killing them. And he said, and they just kept coming. They had never seen that before. He said, in the first 4 hours, he knew the war was over. That fortress Europe that Hitler had created was going to fall. And that's who these guys were.
Out of 400 Medal of Honor medals were given out, not one was given to a black soldier. And I don't think any of you could tell me that you know of a black POW. They were killed. They were not taken prisoner. They were told to kill the black soldiers. I don't think anyone knows of a black POW. Go ahead. We have a couple minutes. Yes?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kessel and the family of Johnny Stevens for this wonderful story. My name is Wendy Jones, and I know what you're talking about. It took me 24 years to write my mother's story. It's also full of history about her life. And my father is in here as a Marine, as a Navy person in World War II. Now, two things. The double V, I don't know, this collided with my dinner hour, so I was half hour late, so you may have discussed it. But you know the double V, what it meant? It wasn't just about the back of the bus. Black soldiers came home in their uniforms and were lynched in their uniforms because they were uppity, right? Because they walked straight and they had their uniform on, which is probably some of them the only clothes they had. They were lynched in their uniforms, all right? Okay, now there was some kind of program where vets could vote, and they voted in the South. Black returning soldiers voted in the South, all right? And the other thing, that story about Lena Horne, I just found out last week about that story where the Nazis were there and the USO was saying you should perform for them. Because she would not perform for the Nazis, she was dropped from the USO program. And like I said, you won't perform for the Nazis, you're out. Okay. So these are stories that people need to know.
The Nazi POWs were able to buy food at the PX.
Yeah, no, my last thing I want to say is my mother worked 3 jobs so I could go to private school. So I went to Dalton in New York, right? One of the best private schools in the country, right? In 8th grade, there was one sentence in our textbook about the Civil War, and it said slavery had nothing to do with fighting the Civil War. That was it. And I said, we're not going to learn about what happened with black people? And my best friend, who was white, in 8th grade said to me, well, slavery couldn't have been too bad. Nobody ran away. So I went to the Schonberg to do research, and every research paper I did from 8th grade to 12th grade was on some aspect of black history, where I was fighting with my friend. And, and so I've been researching ever since. And I've been, just like you, I'm an aficionado of history. All right, finding the stories, not the dates.
A fellow hobby historian.
Yeah, I mean, and it's about the people, it's about the stories. So I really congratulate you, and if I can think of a way to help you get this story out, I will.
We have to leave because it's 8:30, but Doreen brought one of her father's medals, I believe. He did win a bronze, was awarded a Bronze Star, and he wrote a diary. And she brought that, so if you want to go over and see it, and I will speak to anyone about if you can help me.
I will try and get Peter's email, so if you want to contact Peter, write to our website. It has my address, and then I'll contact Peter, and he can contact you. I'd also like to remind everybody, our next meeting is December 6th. We have a Seton Hall professor, Dr. Kimball, speaking on, do you have that paper? I forget the exact topic. December 6th, and then our holiday party is December 11th. You're all welcome. You can again visit the website for information. It'll be at Mayfair Farms, $85 a person. I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.